Hello, everybody. Ooh, I'm a little off center there, aren't I? Aren't I? The day is Wednesday, April 5th, 2017, and this is the promotional Malpractice live chat here on MMAfighting.com. I'm the host of this podcast, Luke Thomas. You might know me from this podcast, the Monday Morning Analyst, SiriusXM, MMA Beat, yada, yada, yada. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Today on the podcast, we're going to talk about UFC 210, I'm sure. Jon Jones returning to speak to the media on Friday. And whatever other questions you might have, best place to get that is going to be wherever this window is embedded on MMAfighting.com. Last week, I asked you guys to give a follow on Instagram, Straight Flexin', Trinidad James style, of the designer of the T-shirts, Old Judd. And he got a bunch of follows. He is now up to 930 followers. I can't really see it all that well. I'll pull back. There it is. There he is. If we could bump him to 1,000, that would be great. Just 70 more. At Judd Lively on Instagram. That'd be great. Also, I just came from the gym. So I'm in a mood, y'all. I'm in a mood. I'm in a mood today. I got to do my daily post-gym ritual. I got off this when I injured my back around UFC 208, but your boy is back on that grind. To the dome like a savage. So something interesting has happened with that. I've taken creatine at various points in my career and life since about the age of 20. And I've always had really good results with it. But this time I got on it, and now the bottom of my left eye twitches when I lift heavy. So I'm like, and then I'll start just twitching. And you might say, Luke, that's a cause for alarm. And I would tell you, no, it's not. I would tell you getting no gains is a cause for alarm. Having a twitchy eyeball is just a collateral damage. Okay. Jesus. Okay, with that out of the way. Oh, y'all like my Nile shirt? Y'all ever been to a death metal concert? They're fun, right? I went to one recently. I went to Nile, as a matter of fact. It's hilarious, though, right? I don't know what people think about death metal exactly, but it's not that you hear the music and you think these are tough people, but generally, this is rougher music. That there might be some kind of carryover into who listens to it, and that's true for bands like Black Label Society, which is not death metal, but it's metal. If you go to a Black Label Society, and this is from experience, you better be ready to knuckle up. It's a violent experience. But you go to these death metal concerts, everyone there hasn't done a sit-up since 1990. They're typically older white guys, balding with long hair. The titles of their songs are like 15 words. On the gates of Ishtar, at the where he meets hell, on the wings of the dragon's approach to the castle. It's like, bro, just get on with it. And then whenever they introduce the next song, a rock star would be like, all right, this next song's called I'm in Love with You. And everyone goes, woo. The death metal guys do this Renaissance fair bit where they go, I'll get these questions in a second. They go, this next song is On the Gates, blah, blah, blah. And the death metal voice, it's like, look, man, I don't, Hannibal, I don't need this. Just play the tune so I can. Thank you. All right. But they're a good band to go see live. If you've never seen Nile, go give them a listen. You'll probably be the most in-shape person there, even if you're a sedentary bovine. All right. With that out of the way, those disclaimers, let's get to some MMA questions, shall we? I told you I was in a mood, man. I had a killer workout today. All right. Cormier's grappling style. Looking back on a few of Cormier's previous fights, particularly the Anderson Silva fight, I noticed how secure he appears on top. Anderson was never able to create any space or even think about attacking off of his back. Well, we've talked about that a little bit. That was partly a conscious choice by him to stall. Does being a stocky, shorter fighter help Cormier in this regard? Yes. And is it better to be lanky like Jon Jones or stocky like Cormier when grappling. Really, it depends entirely on your style and what you prefer. A couple things to keep in mind. In that Anderson Silva fight, he was doing a lockdown, and we talked about it before. I had a couple 10th Planet guys reach out to me and give me a slight correction. My point back then was, if you see someone with a lockdown, if Eddie Bravo gets a lockdown on you, you're going to get turned probably. He's going to find a way to come up on top, set up a submission. You're going to get taken off of your base. But what a lot of guys do with lockdown is they just hold the lockdown, particularly in the gi, if they're feel like they're overmatched, or in this particular case, I don't think he felt like he was overmatched because Silva's a black belt, but probably just wanted to, what they like to do is just prevent you from passing. Now, there are ways out of the lockdown. The way I always was taught was bring your heel to your rear end and then windshield wiper it side to side, and then you can bring your knee up. And so that allows you to free it. Takes a little bit of practice, but it's doable. But you can't just pull out of a lockdown if it's any good. It won't go anywhere. And so he was just holding the lockdown, and the big giveaway for me was he was not fighting for an underhook. If you've ever rolled with someone who's got a really good lockdown, and again, the 10th Planet guys were saying you don't have to have an underhook, but they basically agreed. The overwhelming majority of the attacks from lockdown come with that underhook on the same side. And I'm telling you, if you've ever rolled with a guy who is a lockdown or a 10th Planet kind of style of grappler, man, they're fighting for that underhook. They're like, who was the guy who used to do it back in the day? It wasn't a 10th Planet guy. Gordo used to do it. Again, different style of grappler. But he would just play in half guard, constantly fighting for that underhook. And Silva was like overhooking on the same side, or like, just wrapping up a gable grip or something, not trying anything. That to me is stalling. So if Cormier looked heavy on top, it's partly because Anderson Silva was helping him. But to your point, I think generally it's a great observation, and it's totally true. Keep in mind, even elite wrestlers, like in the gi, if you had to play a gi game, I think you would see a lot from someone like Daniel Cormier. You would be surprised at some of the things he could do from his back, or whatever the case. He could play half guard in a way that might surprise you. But he doesn't really want to. He wants to stick to his strengths, even if he's developed other strengths that he can go to if the game calls for it. In other words, what I think you'll see from Cormier, if he has any choices, he wants to play on top and likely half guard generally. And he could pass if he has to, and he has on certain occasions. But he's a pretty dynamic passer sometimes, particularly once he gets to half guard. His passing from half guard is not bad. But a lot of these wrestlers, elite ones or not elite ones, even just the ones who wrestled in high school, and if they have a heavier, shorter build, they like to work from half guard. They're hard to sweep. Wrestlers are hard to sweep anyway, particularly one as elite as Cormier, who now has other grappling skills added to his game, who doesn't have the ability to create long forms of leverage. Everything is nice, compact, and tight. It's not that that's one advantage over the other. Guys who are lanky might think that is a hellish way to compete. Or you look at the Miao brothers, they could never really, and then they're not MMA fighters, but they don't want to be in that kind of position. A lot of guys don't. They want to do more dynamic things. They want to be able to roll to the back, or, have more mobile passing on top. They may not want to sit in half guard, but for a guy who's built that way, who comes from a wrestling background, controlling space, driving weight down, using your base to control a leg or a hip or both hips. This is something that they're going to be focusing on. Less concerned about moving to mount and really advancing the threat positionally. There might be some of that, right? But not a whole lot necessarily. But they definitely like tight control on top, weight sinking down, and giving you no ability to use your other leg or your hip mobility to set up a sweep. Because remember, what you need for a sweep? You have to lift someone off of their base and block a side and then turn them to it. In almost every case, that's what a sweep requires. So if you have a super hardcore lockdown half guard and you can pass to that same side, most everyone passes to their left, then yeah, you can do a lot with it, right? Personally, and I've said this before, everyone's like, and Neil Magny is a really good grappler, like a very, very good grappler. I don't think being lanky is a bad thing, but you often see guys who have a lanky build, and everyone goes, oh man, they got a killer guard. Well, they've got a killer guard because they can reach and lock up places in ways that someone like Cormier couldn't. Like for Cormier, an armbar is always going to be an armbar is basically accessible to anybody, right? But it's going to be hard for him to triangle somebody, right? just speaking realistically. But for Neil Magny, he can do a lot, right? He's got a lot of length and dexterity and flexibility. He's a thinner body frame, so he can compact himself more. But at the same time, we saw that get exposed a little bit against someone like Demian Maia. Now, Demian Maia is Demian Maia, right? Getting exposed against him is not the end of the world. But here's my point. One of the big lessons that shout out to, and I bring him up all the time because he's just an incredible teacher. If you're ever in Richmond, Virginia, you got to go check out Upstream BJJ. I'm not paid to give this plug. I'm just giving it to him. Go check out him. He's a Ryan Hall black belt, and he made a bunch of great points as I was coming up years ago. And he was basically saying, like, if someone can get to the side of you, but if they don't occupy the space between your hip and let's say your elbow or hip, and even better, your armpit, they haven't really passed. And what you want is you want to sink into that groove. But if the groove is tight, you're just kind of up against it. Now you can do things from that, but it's not exactly the same as passing. Being to the side of someone and being passed into side control are kind of two different things, especially if someone's really good on the bottom. And what you saw against Demian Maia was those long, lanky guys. Sometimes they can get stretched out. And what happens when I stretch my legs out to reach for something, because you're making me react, now there is a effing mountain of space between the top of their legs, the outside of their legs, and their hip, and their elbow or their armpit. And Maia just occupied it quickly. Now, again, I understand it's Demian Maia, but you see a lot of that in MMA. You see a lot of lanky guys who reach with their legs. They open up that space, comes up, legs shoot out, and they get passed. And everyone looks at that body type like, oh, that body type is great. That body type is a ton of real estate you got to cover with your elbows and hips and legs. You got to keep everything nice and tight in there. Otherwise, when you get passed, you're going to be in trouble. It's really, really, really hard. And when those guys have to shrimp or create some kind of scramble to recover that space, they got to move a lot further. So it all depends on what kind of style of grappling you like and how good you are with it. But to me, you want someone who's lanky-ish, but not really lanky. And if you're a good wrestler who just likes top control and you got a little bit of passing, Cormier's build is pretty good for that too. It just depends on the style of attack. Someone says, don't forget the fat. Okay. Hi, Luke. I couldn't tell you my excitement when Promotional Malpractice shirts were finally put on sale. I went to MMA Warehouse less than 5 minutes after you put up the link. My excitement, this has 9 recs. My excitement turned to disappointment as the largest size available was 2X. In the next batch, please make available some shirts for your larger customers. I don't want to miss out rocking the head donk just because I eat pizza rolls at 7-Eleven for dinner. I see you, player. All right. Also, now that we know Luke Thomas's apparel is a proven seller, please make the next shirt the top dog of MMA Barbas. I would be all about that. P.S. Hope James Glory returns in 2017. Y'all know what happened to him? He was in and out of the hospital, and then he's gone radio silent. I am afraid for the worst here. And then PPS, I hope you get a shout out when Ariel and New York Rick do the Marine spot. Yes. Me and Brian Stan should get one. Okay, a couple things. For the next batch, I'll make some 3X. They cost a little bit more to do than the ordinary, even 2X or XL. So there'll be a minimum number of them. But real quickly about this, I've gotten overwhelming response from people saying they want the next shirt to be Barbas. If you do, email me. Seriously, I'm not a joke. I need to know. I need some kind of a head count about what kind of enthusiasm there is. Luke.thomas@SBNation.com, or you can tweet me at SBNLukeThomas. If you're a thumbs up for the Barber shirt, let me know. If you're thumbs down for it, let me know too. Because I can't tell if it's just anecdotal evidence that there's a lot of interest or there actually is a lot of interest. If there is, we will definitely make them. But there's a bunch more shirts coming out. The next one that has the logo on it that we had from last time, the shirt will be black like this, and the inside will be like sort of white and yellow. It looks really cool. So, and again, that comes from Judd, who y'all all should be following on Instagram. All right. Let's see. Okay. Oh, someone sent something to me? What is this? Oh, damn. Y'all made some intros with the logo? What? Dude, that is killer. Look at me mouth breathing like Pat Lundvall over here. Yeah, hit me up. Here we go. Email me, please. All right, UFC International Fight Week. So in a couple of months, UFC International Fight Week will happen, and normally there is always something huge there. This year there are 3 events, and there are some fights targeted, but nothing really huge. Lawler versus Cerrone, but I know what you mean. A lot of fun fights like Cody TJ, Overeem Verdum 3, Lawler Cerrone, right? But the big question is, of course, what will be the main event? It looks like UFC wants GSP versus Bisping, but GSP wants to fight later. It's obvious there'll be no McGregor or Rousey, which could carry the pay-per-views. Also, if the winner of this weekend's main event comes out banged up, will there be no Jones opportunity? I don't see the UFC going back and pulling in Lesnar. So my question is, who in the hell is going to headline that weekend? This is the million-dollar question that I don't have a good answer for. The only thing which I thought would be very intriguing, and I know both fighters don't like it, would be a Diaz doubleheader with Nate main eventing against Tony for the interim belt, and Diaz having the rematch against Lawler. But now Lawler is with Cerrone. Maybe Nick against Wonderboy or Gunny, or even more cool, get Condit in there, and I'll bet he gets excited for another Diaz scrap. What do you think, Luke? If not the Diaz bros, who else can carry that pay-per-view? I have no earthly idea. I mean, they would have to pull a rabbit out of their hat for that one, right? You've basically laid out the problem pretty well. We went over this in the MMA Beat. They don't want to do, GSP's looking for some kind of fall timeline, but the UFC is probably a little bit afraid of running into Mayweather McGregor, because that's going to be like $100 pay-per-view probably, or certainly more than $60 or maybe even $70, probably at a minimum. And it's going to be, a lot of people's budget for that time of the year or that month or whatever the case may be. So it might run into and run over anything else you put beside it. And if you're going to, the whole point of doing GSP versus Bisping was to do a money fight. Well, you better make sure you're in a place to make sure it gets the kind of money that it can, at its maximal level, get. And if you do that in close proximity to any kind of Mayweather McGregor fight, it's really not going to happen. So, so this is tough. The Diaz one is interesting. If they could make it happen, they would have to come up off their pockets to get them to do that. And even then, I don't know if that would really work for them, because what we talked about before, those guys like to be the B-side in terms of the level of popularity that their opponent has. But maybe there's something that can be worked out. That's certainly a possibility. But right now, what you're articulating is, I think, all of our obvious concerns. There's not a ton of options. The question I'm really wondering is, and I don't know the answer to this, is to what extent can Jones be promoted in a fight before the fight has been sanctioned by the Athletic Commission? I wonder what that would be. Because technically, he would be available. Technically, he would be off suspension by the time UFC 213 rolled around. The issue is he would have been off for just a matter of days. So to what extent in advance can they promote that? If they can bring Jones back, he can get the winner of this weekend's main event, that changes things. But I don't know what the rules are about that. And even if there are no, rules prohibiting it, and it's just a matter of procedure before the time he's off suspension, there's still this sort of really interesting look that the UFC might go through, where it's like, hey, we're promoting a guy who's still serving out a suspension while he's on suspension. That gets into a little bit of tricky territory about whether you even want to engage in that kind of practice. But to your point, when the rubber meets the road, they got to make some tough decisions. And the GSP one is curious to me. What I'm guessing he really wants to do is to naturally put on enough size in a proper amount of time it takes to wear it in a way that isn't a hindrance. And you can't do that overnight. You can't just put on the weight. I mean, you can put on the weight real fast, you can operate at a caloric surplus, and you can lift weights like an MFR, and you can train, and you can get big, especially with his genetics, relatively quickly. You could do so by July, but the question is, you wouldn't have settled into the weight naturally. I'm guessing that's his biggest concern. In which case, you can understand why he would want to fight later in the year. It's a real hindrance. But my other part is like, dude, you had no background in this weight class. You took a fight because, obviously St. Pierre's a legend. But, if we're going to make these weird fights, and I understand that we need to put a premium on how competitive they are. And I think there's reason to think that this might be competitive, reason to think it might not be competitive, right? It's a weird fight in that sense. But my only point is, if we're going to make these accommodations and go outside this divisional architecture that I think is much more important than we often give credence to, you got to make some concessions too. Like, You have no experience in this weight class at all. You assiduously avoided it at every turn imaginable when you were an active competitor. And now we got to wait for you to put on the weight supernaturally. Not supernaturally, but super space naturally. Yeah, I don't think so. If that's really what's holding them up, I think that they should just sort of find a way to make that happen beforehand, to the extent possible. So this is a tricky one. You might get a international fight week where you have 3 events in 3 days, and all 3 are good. Hey, there's good fights on Thursday, good fights on Friday, even great fights on Saturday, but nothing that really is a head turner, a seminal moment, a monumental occasion. That is very, very, very possible at this juncture. So look out. Let's get this out of the way. When is Nick Nate Diaz fighting again? Don't know. Where's Robbie Lawler training? Combat Club. Can Conor beat Floyd? Can he? Yes, he can. There you go. UFC Nashville. Hi, Luke. I was looking at some of the upcoming UFC cards, and UFC Nashville is one that really stood out to me. What do you think of the card? Are there any fights are you particularly looking forward to? I completely agree. On my radio show at the beginning of every month, we go through all of the major events in MMA that month, and then I put a call to the listener saying, what fights are you looking forward to most this month? I got to say, the UFC and Fox 24 card is a banger, and the UFC Nashville one's not bad. Now, that main event's kind of weird, but there's a lot to like generally on that card. So here's what they have. Lobov versus Swanson. I mean, that's either going to be exactly what we think it is, where Swanson's just going to steamroll him, or Lobov is going to get, he's going to use his big power to get the biggest win of his career. It's a tough fight for Swanson insofar as all indications are he should be able to beat Lobov, but terribly damaging if he doesn't. Al Iaquinta versus Diego Sanchez. Diego Sanchez out there. Diego Sanchez, people don't realize this. Diego Sanchez is MMA's Russell Wilson, which is to say these guys who I bought this miracle water that has more oxygenated bubbles in it, which helps with absorption. It's like, no, Diego. No, it doesn't. But if you think it does, and that affects your performance, then I'm all in. Diego Sanchez is like the king of – you ever seen those studies where he's the king of the placebo effect? You ever seen those studies where it's like we gave 2 groups, one control, one experiment. In the control group, we gave sugar pills. And in the experimental group, we gave them sugar pills, but we told them it was, I don't know, something that to help them with some kind of ailment. And then you wind up seeing that because they believed it was – that over time the experimental group had some measure of, demonstrable improvement in whatever condition that the sugar pills would ordinarily have no effect on, but because they believed it, it did. That's Diego Sanchez. Like everyone's like, he's wasting his money on this crap. Right. I'm not saying it actually works in under any kind of scientific scrutiny. What I am saying is there is scientific scrutiny to demonstrate that the placebo effect can be real. And Diego Sanchez is the king of that. So to me, I'm all in. Ovid St. Preux versus Marcos Rogerio de Lima. I don't have a ton of interest in it. John Dodson versus Eddie Wineland. Great fight. Bantamweight fight, by the way. So I like Dodson's chances, but that should be fun. How about this one? Joe Lazon versus Stevie Ray. Got action fight written all over it. Jake Ellenberger versus Mike Perry. Come on, y'all. Platinum deadlift Mike Perry versus Jake Ellenberger. Sick fight. And then on the prelim card, which will be on Fox Sports 2, Talis Leites versus Sam Alvey. That'll be a bit of a banger. Dustin Ortiz versus Brandon Moreno. That's a great, great flyweight fight. Scott Holtzman versus Michael McBride. No interest. Jessica Penny versus Danielle Taylor. I'm curious to see if Penny can sort of right the ship of her career. I don't know if she's really been the same since that Ian Jacek loss. So, but I know she trains hard and people around her have a lot of high praise for her. So we'll see what she can do there. Then you have Brian Barberena versus Joe Proctor. That's going to be probably surprisingly competitive. Alexis Davis versus Cindy Dandois, and then Hector Sandoval versus Matt Schnell. So a little thin towards the bottom. There's some decent action there as well, but to your point, yeah, there's a lot to like there. So it says, Luke, I'm headed to D.C. for a few days. Any recommendations of places to check out? Someone writes below him, Smithsonian museums are awesome. There's also a cool food plaza in an old rail station, if I recall. It's called Union Station, and the entire bottom floor is a food plaza. But it's all kind of like bad food. It's like Chipotle. Well, Chipotle's all right, but, it's a lot of, Church's Chicken and Taco Bell. No one says, I attended a conference in D.C., and the Smithsonian museums are great. Yes, I agree. Air and Space is cool. Do yourself a favor. You have to pay to get in. If you ever come to D.C., go to the Newseum. The Newseum is a museum about the news. And there's a couple. It's not just you're learning about media, which you may not care about, but they have like living exhibits, and so they have one about they have one about espionage, but also not government surveillance, Edward Snowden style, but I mean sort of law enforcement catching people who have been long-standing thorns in their side. So, for example, they have, you can look at it. You can actually, like, I think you can look deep inside. You can't walk inside, but they have the Unabomber shed. They have the actual shed of the Unabomber, and you can go and look at it. My man was living sparse. They have a handwritten note in the same section of a different part. I think it was like crime, basically. But they have a handwritten note from Saddam Hussein to George Bush. They have a lot of the old like pocket watches and Tommy guns that Al Capone used to have and use, like tons of cool stuff. They've got a Sports Illustrated sports photography section with, by the way, a ton of combat sports photos in there, mostly boxing, but they are awesome. They've got one with like this green background, and it was when Bernard Hopkins, I mean, I know he rechanged his name, but before he changed his name, when he was originally the executioner, it is a killer photograph. They've got every front page of every newspaper the day after 9/11 from all over the world. They have every front page of every newspaper that day that you can check out. You can read 16th century recitations and of how the Spanish Armada viewed any kind of interaction with some opposing fleet, and then read that opposing fleet's same recitation of that engagement. I mean, it's an incredible, amazingly curated place. You can see they have a monument to all journalists, like particularly war journalists who died in the line of work. Not that, I'm not comparing them to soldiers, but some of these people are pretty heroic. And they have, if you want to take your kids, they have a section where you can do all. I mean, I'm belaboring the point, but check out the Newseum. And for places to eat, just check Yelp because there's too many. All right. UFC using Bellator. Ever since the UFC was purchased by WME-IMG in July, talk of a refined schedule and emphasis on money fights has been discussed. If this is the way forward, the UFC surely won't be able to grow talent themselves like they could before, as each fight on each card will need more attention. Could they therefore be purposefully growing Bellator's status as a promotion so that young talent can get properly developed and grow name value before joining the UFC? Well, there's a couple of things about this. They haven't really trimmed the schedule, number one. Number two, Bellator has made some acquisitions, but in terms of like ranked talent, there hasn't been enough of a mass exodus to really say there's some kind of sea change. Now, there's been enough to get us, like, it's they've gotten some big names, Larkin, Bader, right? The value there is the perception it creates, because even that kind of thing was basically unthinkable 2 years ago. But letting a handful of guys go who the promotion can lose without suffering any kind of status issue, at least insofar as with the mainstream fans, is not evidence of a substantive change. Nor do I think that they're letting guys just go to Bellator, right? They're not letting Dylan Dennis go to Bellator. One of the major problems with the UFC, and they've been running into this with Sage Northcutt, and he's an older guy, but same thing you get with CM Punk. They have no real way of grooming underdeveloped talent. They just are not built for it. It's really, really difficult for them. They can try putting guys on, prelim portions of cards with, tough Latin America washouts. Even that is a risky proposition, depending on how things go. Brock Lesnar coming in with, one fight against Min Soo Kim. This is such an aberrant thing. It's totally aberrant thing. You can see how hard it is to do something with that. So it's less of, oh man, UFC really wanted Dylan Dennis. I'm sure there is a part of UFC that wants Dylan Dennis, but I think they also realize we just don't have space for him here. It's not, Ed Ruth. I'm sure they have their eyes on Ed Ruth. They're not stupid over there. Aaron Pico, all those guys, Tyrell Fortune, the works. The difference is that Bellator is uniquely situated to give those guys experience at the early nascent stages of their professional career while using some of their popularity or hardcore intrigue to develop more buzz around them. Bellator has that competitive advantage in a way that the UFC doesn't. Bellator, when it comes to like who has all the top guys, it's been a very minor fluctuation in terms of transfer. And of course, ACB has picked up some guys. Ryzen has picked up some guys. So generally, there's been, I think, more of an exodus generally, but but relative to what Bellator's picked up, it's not as much. To me, the bigger issue is one, they'll probably keep doing that to some extent, but I don't think they're letting Bellator do that. They can't make it work. There's no UFC light. There's no Strikeforce Challenger show where they could sign guys like that and then bring them up. You know, Ronda Rousey came up on the Strikeforce Challengers cards for a while anyway. That's where she was. Now, she was blowing through people like Julia Budd back then so fast that it didn't make a whole lot of sense, but you get the idea. UFC doesn't have that. You know, that's not what their product is. Their product is we're up here. And so everyone who eventually might get there, but is here, Bellator is like, we got you. You know, it just makes so much more sense for them. So to me, that's the bigger story here. Everyone's like free agents leaving UFC. More will do that, but you have to feel like they're not idiots over there. There's probably a limit to what they're willing to let go of. I think to me, the real test Santos versus Eric Spicely. That's a sick fight. Paulo Henrique Costa versus Olawale Bamboshe. So Bohashinya versus Bambos, whatever you pronounce his name as. And then Leonardo Santos versus Olivia Albin Marcier. That's a really good fight too. That's really good matchmaking. Santos versus Albin Marcier, some good matchmaking. I suspect you might get Vitor added to that. Let's see. All right. I'll get Vitor added to that and not much more. It's not clear who else is going to be able to do that. You got JDS fighting at 211. 213, they're still building out, but it's not clear who from the Brazilian market they could really pull in to do it. Now, maybe Cyborg, if they could find something to make it work with her, that's a possibility as well, right? But other than that, you just sort of think who's going to be in these Brazilian cards. And it was always that way. It was always like, oh, who's going to be in these Brazilian cards? But now it's more of they've got 3 shows a year there. 3 shows. So they've really got to make them count. You know, if they're going to do a pay-per-view, yes, they need big stars, but they need people that really appeal to that Brazilian market who also have a bit of a name here, right? It's us in Canada who are basically responsible from the pay-per-view side of things to make that a success. And then, the local audience for the live gate. And for that live gate and for Combate, they need to get those Brazilian names on there. So Belfort, I suspect, will be on there, and maybe Cyborg. And that's probably really about it. Is Cyborg even going to be off suspension by then? I'm not even sure. Or whatever the retroactive TUE situation is. I can't even keep track of it. But just think who are your bigger Brazilian names, and that's going to be about it. No audio. Jesus Christ. Sorry, guys. I don't know what to do about it. I legit lost like 300 live viewers doing that. Sweet. So sweet. Bellator this weekend. You would almost forget with the UFC 210 pay-per-view, but there's also a Bellator this weekend. Yep, and it's super, super nubs. But I will say this. Let me pull up the Bellator this weekend. Here's what I'll say about it. Here's this question. As a big Manhoff fan, I hope he can finally get a nice crown so late in his career. Blah, 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 blah. I don't know if you follow kickboxing so much these days, Luke, but of course you know you did some work for Glory. And Bonyansky has been calling out Rico Verhoeven a lot recently, but Rico chose to fight Ben Sadiq. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so here's who's on this card for this weekend in Bellator, and this is going to be in Torino, Italy. So the main card is